Alessio Trevisano had been sitting at table 14 every Thursday and Saturday evening for 6 weeks, always arriving at precisely 9:30 p.m., always ordering the same bottle of Chianti, always leaving tips that made the sommelier raise his eyebrows. But watching David Romano grab Julia Coleman by the wrist and drag her toward the kitchen made something ancient and feral awaken inside him. The restaurant owner had just signed his own death warrant, because Alessio had already decided that the brown-haired waitress with the nervous smile and wounded eyes belonged to him. And in Florence, when Alessio Trevisano claimed something, God himself couldn't take it away. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. Are you subscribed? Because if you're not, you're basically listening to this story as a stranger passing through, and I don't want that for us. Click the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you would be among the first people to hear my next story. Done? Let's continue. Julia Coleman had been in Florence for 8 months, and she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At 29, she'd learned to trust her instincts. They'd saved her life more than once, and right now, those instincts were screaming that the man at table 14 was dangerous. Not dangerous in the way Nicholas Vane had been dangerous, with his charming lies and financial manipulations that left her holding the bag for his crimes. This was different. Controlled. Deliberate. The kind of danger that came wrapped in custom-tailored suits and devastatingly handsome features that looked carved from Carrara marble. Alessio Trevisano. She'd learned his name after the second time he'd requested her section, whispered by the hostess with something that sounded like reverence mixed with fear. The reservation system listed no age, no details, just his name and a note in Italian she couldn't read, but that made the manager's face go pale when he saw it. He had the kind of presence that made the dining room shift when he entered, like gravity itself bent toward him. Tonight he wore what he always wore, black trousers and a black dress shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, revealing a tanned throat and the hint of something tattooed on his chest that she'd never gotten close enough to identify. His dark hair was slightly longer than the fashion, curling just past his collar in waves that looked perpetually tousled, like he'd been running his hands through it or had just woken up in someone's bed. He had a shadow of stubble along his strong jaw that never quite became a beard, and dark eyes so dark they looked black in the candlelight that tracked her every movement with an intensity that made her hands shake when she poured wine. He wasn't classically handsome in the polished way of the British bankers Julia had known in London. There was something rougher about him, something untamed beneath the expensive watch and the confident posture. He smiled when she approached, listened attentively when she described the specials, but his eyes stayed sharp and calculating even when his mouth curved with warmth. She'd served enough powerful men in her 8 months at La Belle Notte to recognize the type. Alessio Trevisano was someone important, someone influential, and definitely someone involved in things that didn't bear close examination, which was why Julia had spent 6 weeks trying to figure out if he was connected to Nicholas. If her ex-fiancé had somehow tracked her from London to Florence and sent this beautiful, terrifying man to watch her, to report back on her location, to drag her back to face the consequences of crimes she hadn't committed. The rational part of her brain knew it was paranoid. Nicholas was in prison, or possibly dead, depending on which rumor you believed. He didn't have the resources to hire expensive muscle in another country. But the scared part of her, the part that still woke up from nightmares of police raids and interrogations, and seeing her face on the news, couldn't let it go. So she smiled when Alessio ordered his Chianti Classico Reserva, tried not to flinch when his fingers brushed hers as he handed back the wine list, and counted down the minutes until he left each night. What she didn't understand was why, despite her fear, she felt something else when he looked at her. Something warm and electric that coiled low in her stomach and made her hyper-aware of her body, of the space between them, of the way his gaze lingered on her mouth when she spoke. It was unwanted and inappropriate and absolutely terrifying. But it was there. Had been there since the first night he'd walked in, and she'd spilled wine on his lap while trying to serve the table next to his, and instead of being angry, he'd smiled like she'd just done something charming. Julia had changed everything about herself when she fled London. Her hair had been long and chestnut brown, falling to her waist in the straight, sleek style Nicholas had preferred. She'd cut it all off in a train station bathroom in Paris, hacking away with nail scissors until it barely brushed her shoulders. Then she'd gone to a salon in Florence and had them add caramel highlights and style it into soft waves that framed her face. She'd thrown away her tailored dresses and started wearing simple black trousers and white shirts, the uniform of invisibility. She'd changed her email, gotten a new phone, stopped using social media entirely. The woman Nicholas Vane had used and betrayed no longer existed. Except she did. She existed in the way Giulia still flinched when men raised their voices, in the way she checked over her shoulder constantly, expecting to see police or reporters or worse, in the way she kept a go-bag packed under her bed, cash, passport, a change of clothes just in case she needed to run again. She existed in the paranoia that made Giulia suspicious of every regular customer, every man who looked at her twice, every generous tip that seemed too good to be true. Like the tips Alessio Trevisano left. 200 euros. 350 euros. Once 500 euros on a bill that had been less than 80 euros. It was insane. It was suspicious. And it was the only reason she could afford her tiny studio apartment in Santo Spirito, in a building with actual locks on the doors, and a landlord who didn't ask questions about her lack of Italian work history. Tonight was Friday, which meant La Belle Notte was packed with tourists and wealthy locals celebrating the weekend. The restaurant was in the heart of Florence's historic center, an elegant establishment housed in a Renaissance palazzo that attracted the kind of clientele who thought nothing of spending thousands of euros on wine. Giulia had gotten the job because she was fluent in English, willing to work late shifts, and desperate enough not to ask about the restaurant's conspicuous lack of interest in checking her work permit too carefully. She was refilling water glasses when she saw Alessio arrive at his usual time, 9:30 p.m. He moved through the dining room with a casual confidence that made other diners turn to look. Two men in dark suits flanked him like shadows, taking a table near the entrance, while Alessio headed straight for table 14, the corner booth with clear sight lines to every entrance and exit. A tactician's seat, a dangerous man's seat. His dark eyes found her immediately, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, satisfaction, possession, she couldn't name it, but it made her stomach flip. Miss Coleman, the hostess, Francesca, appeared at her elbow, her voice low and urgent. Table 14 is requesting you specifically. Of course he was. He always did. Giulia smoothed down her apron, checked that her hair was neat, and forced herself to walk across the dining room with confidence she didn't feel. Mr. Trevisano, she said, pulling out her notepad. Welcome back. The usual? Giulia. He always used her first name, his Italian accent making it sound like a caress, drawing out the vowels. Giulia. You know me so well. Chianti Classico Reserva, she said, writing it down even though she didn't need to. She knew his order by heart. And shall I have Chef Marco prepare something special for you tonight? You look tired, Alessio said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. Concern? Surely not. Long shift? Every shift is long, Mr. Trevisano, Giulia said carefully. But I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Alessio, he corrected, like he did every time. After 6 weeks, I think we can dispense with formalities, no? That wouldn't be appropriate, Giulia said. You're a customer. I'm a waitress. You're a woman who works harder than anyone else in this restaurant, Alessio said, his dark eyes holding hers. Who carries trays that should require 2 people but refuses to ask for help because you don't want anyone to think you're weak? Who arrives early and stays late and never, ever complains? I notice these things, Giulia. I notice you. Her breath caught. That was too specific, too observant. How long had he been watching her? I should get your wine, she said. One more thing. Alessio's hand moved to his jacket pocket, and Giulia's body tensed instinctively before he pulled out a simple business card, cream-colored with elegant black text. My private number, in case you ever need anything at all. I won't need anything, Giulia said. But she took the card anyway because refusing felt more dangerous than accepting. But thank you. She fled to the bar, her heart racing. He'd noticed that she refused help, that she pushed herself too hard, that she was barely holding it together most nights. What else had he noticed? Did he know she was running from something? Someone? The bartender, Antonio, raised an eyebrow as he poured the Chianti. Trevisano making you nervous again? He's just a customer, Giulia said. He's not just anything, Antonio said quietly, glancing toward table 14. You know who he is, right? What he is? I don't want to know, Giulia said firmly. I take his order. He leaves a good tip. That's all I need to know. Stai attenta, Antonio warned. Be careful. Men like that, they're dangerous both ways, when they want you and when they don't. Giulia delivered the wine, took Alessio's dinner order, and tried to focus on her other tables, but she felt his eyes on her all night, tracking her movements, watching her with that unnerving intensity. When she brought his secondo grilled branzino with rosemary, he asked about her life in Florence, if she'd visited the Uffizi yet, if she'd made friends. She deflected with practiced ease, keeping everything surface level and professional. She was clearing his dessert plates. He never ate dessert, just ordered espresso when David Romano appeared. The restaurant owner was in his early 50s, with silver hair slicked back and a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. He'd been pressuring Julia for weeks about opportunities she could pursue, suggestions that made her skin crawl, implications that her work visa situation could become complicated if she didn't show more gratitude for his employment. "Julia," David said, his hand suddenly on her arm, fingers digging in just above her elbow. "A word. Now." "I'm working," Julia said, trying to pull away subtly, aware of the other diners watching. "Can it wait until—" "No, it can't wait." His grip tightened, not quite painful but definitely not gentle. "We need to discuss your future here. Kitchen, now." Julia's eyes darted to Alessio, who had gone completely still, his espresso cup frozen halfway to his lips, his dark eyes locked on David's hand on her arm. And in that moment, Julia realized two things. First, that she'd been right to be afraid of Alessio Trevisano, and second, that she'd been afraid of the wrong thing. Because the look on his face wasn't the look of a man sent to watch her. It was the look of a man about to commit murder. The kitchen doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the elegant dining room and trapping Julia alone with David Romano. She'd been in situations like this before, cornered, vulnerable, at the mercy of a man who thought he owned her. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Because she'd seen the way Alessio Trevisano's knuckles had gone white around his espresso cup, the way his jaw had clenched, the way he'd set down the cup with careful precision and begun to rise from his seat. Julia didn't know what was about to happen. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that David Romano had just made a terrible mistake. The kitchen was too bright after the romantic dimness of the dining room, all harsh fluorescent lights and stainless steel that reflected Julia's pale face back at her in fractured images. David's hand was still clamped around her arm as he dragged her past the line cooks, who suddenly became very interested in their mise en place, heads down, refusing to meet her eyes. She knew that look. She'd seen it before, in the offices of Vane Capital when the police had come for Nicholas. The look of people who knew something terrible was happening but had decided their own survival mattered more than intervening. "You're on your own, Julia. You've always been on your own." "Do you think I'm stupid?" David hissed, finally releasing her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling against the prep counter. 6 weeks of playing hard to get. 6 weeks of pretending you don't understand what I'm offering you." Julia's mind was fracturing, the way it always did when fear took over. Part of her was here, in this too-bright kitchen in Florence, facing down a predator in an expensive suit. But part of her was back in London, 20 months ago, standing in her apartment, while 2 Metropolitan Police detectives told her that her fiancé had embezzled £4.7 million from his clients and disappeared. "Miss Coleman, we need to ask you some questions about your involvement in Mr. Vane's investment scheme." "My involvement? I don't. I work in marketing. I don't even understand what Nicholas does. Did. You lived with him, shared bank accounts, benefited from the stolen funds." "I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know." But they hadn't believed her. Why would they? The beautiful girlfriend, the expensive flat in Mayfair, the designer clothes Nicholas had insisted on buying her. She'd looked guilty, so she must be guilty. "Are you listening to me?" David's voice snapped her back to the present. He was closer now, backing her against the counter, his cologne overpowering in the confined space. "You think you can work in my restaurant, take my money, and not give me anything in return?" "I work for my wages," Julia said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I do my job. I don't owe you anything else." David laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Your job. Let's talk about your job, Julia. Or should I call you by your real name? The one that shows up when you run a proper background check?" Her blood went cold. He knew. Of course he knew. She'd been stupid to think she could hide forever, that a dye job in a new city would be enough to erase her past. The woman accused of helping her fiancé steal millions. David continued, enjoying her fear. "Never charged, but never cleared either. Interesting that you ended up working for me with forged references and an expired work permit." The room tilted. Julia gripped the edge of the counter to stay upright, her mind racing through options. Run, but where? She had maybe €300 in her apartment. Not enough to disappear again. Stay and face him, but what did he want? What would he demand in exchange for his silence? Nothing good. Men like David Romano never want anything good. "I have a proposal," David said, and his hand came up to touch her hair, making her flinch. A business arrangement. There are men, wealthy men, who come to La Belle Notte and appreciate additional services, private entertainment. You're beautiful, you're educated, you speak English. You'd be perfect. The words hit her like a physical blow. He wasn't just threatening her, he was trying to traffic her. No, Julia whispered, then louder, finding some buried reserve of strength. No, I won't. You can't make me. Can't I? David's pleasant mask dropped entirely, revealing something ugly underneath. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, the same wrist Alessio had noticed earlier, now throbbing under David's brutal grip. You're in my country illegally, working under false pretenses, connected to an international fraud case. One phone call and you're in custody. One phone call and you're deported back to London to face whatever charges are waiting for you there. He started pulling her deeper into the kitchen, toward the back office where he kept his desk, his laptop, his private space where no one would interrupt. You're going to listen to my proposal, David said, and you're going to agree, because you don't have any other choice. Julia tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Panic clawed at her throat. This couldn't be happening. Not again. She'd run so far, changed so much, tried so hard to disappear. The kitchen door swung open with enough force to bang against the wall. Every head turned. The line cooks, the dishwasher, David, his hand still clamped around Julia's wrist, and Alessio Trevisano, standing in the doorway like an avenging angel dressed in black, his dark eyes taking in the scene with a single, comprehensive glance that missed nothing. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. Let her go, Alessio said quietly. His voice was soft, conversational even, but there was something underneath it, something ancient and absolutely deadly, that made Julia's breath catch, and David's hand spasm around her wrist before he quickly released her. Mr. Trevisano, David said, his voice suddenly obsequious, his entire demeanor shifting. This is a private matter. Employee discipline. Nothing that concerns. Everything that concerns her, Alessio interrupted, taking a step into the kitchen. Concerns me. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, and Julia watched in horrified fascination as David actually backed up, his face paling. I don't think you understand, David tried again. She works for me. This is my restaurant. No, Alessio said and smiled. It was the most terrifying smile Julia had ever seen. It's mine. You just manage it. A distinction you seem to have forgotten. The world tilted again, but in a different direction this time. He owns La Belle Notte. The man at table 14 owns the restaurant. And she, Alessio continued, his eyes never leaving David's face, is under my protection, which means you just made the worst mistake of your very short remaining career. Julia's knees nearly gave out. Protection. He'd said protection. But men like Alessio Trevisano didn't offer protection for free. Everything had a price. Everything required payment. What will he demand in return? But as Alessio's gaze shifted to her, something in his expression softened infinitesimally concern, she thought, or perhaps fury on her behalf, and Julia realized with absolute certainty that whatever price Alessio Trevisano demanded, it wouldn't be the same thing David Romano had wanted. It would be something far more dangerous. It would be everything. The kitchen door swung open. Silence fell like a guillotine blade. Julia had seen Alessio Trevisano walk into rooms before, into the dining room of La Belle Notte with its soft lighting and elegant clientele, moving with casual confidence that made heads turn. But this was different. This was a man walking into a space where he didn't belong, where customers never ventured, and somehow making it feel like everywhere else was the intrusion. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the dim corridor beyond, his dark eyes sweeping the kitchen with the precision of a man assessing a battlefield. His expression was calm, almost pleasant, but there was something underneath it that made Julia's stomach drop. A coldness, a calculation, the face of a man deciding who lived and who died. Chef Marco dropped the pan he was holding. It clattered against the stove with a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the sudden quiet. One of the line cooks actually took a step backward, hands raised as if in surrender. And the dishwasher, a young man named Paolo who'd worked at La Belle Notte for years, went absolutely white and whispered something in rapid Italian that Julia's fragmented understanding almost caught. Dio mio, e Alessio Trevisano. The way he said it. The reverence mixed with pure, undiluted terror, like he'd just seen the devil himself walk through the door. Julia's mind raced, trying to connect the pieces, the expensive suits, the bodyguards, The way the manager's face had gone pale when he'd seen Alessio's reservation. The warnings from Antonio, the private table with sightlines to every exit, the careful observation, the excessive tips that seemed less like generosity and more like ownership. "Mr. Trevisano," David said, recovering some of his composure, though his voice was higher than usual, strained. "As I said, this is a private employee matter. I appreciate your concern, but nothing." Alessio's voice was soft, conversational. He took a step into the kitchen, and Julia watched David actually flinch. "You were explaining to Julia here about how this is your restaurant, your staff, your authority." David's face flushed. "With all due respect, I manage this establishment. Personnel decisions are within my purview." "You forget who pays your bills, David." Alessio took another step forward, hands in his pockets, completely relaxed, except for his eyes. His eyes were dead and cold, and absolutely terrifying. "You forget who owns the building you're standing in, who owns La Belle Notte, who owns every bottle of wine in that cellar and every table in that dining room." The blood drained from David's face so quickly, Julia thought he might actually faint. "You own—" David's voice was barely a whisper. "Everything," Alessio confirmed. "The restaurant, the building, the liquor license in your name that I can revoke with a phone call. You manage my property, David. You work for me. Which means everyone in this kitchen works for me." His gaze shifted to Julia, and something in his expression changed, softened, just fractionally. "Including her?" Julia couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The wealthy customer at table 14 wasn't a customer at all. He was, what? Her employer? No, something more than that. Something infinitely more dangerous. Alessio Trevisano. She'd heard that name before, she realized. Whispered in the break room when the staff thought she couldn't hear their Italian. Mentioned in news articles she'd scrolled past without really reading. A businessman, they said. A philanthropist. But underneath those words, always the implication of something else. Something darker. "I didn't know," David stammered. "I thought the ownership papers say—" "The ownership papers say what I want them to say," Alessio said. "And right now, what I want is for you to take your hand off her arm." Julia looked down, surprised. She'd almost forgotten David's grip had loosened in shock but hadn't released completely. His fingers were still wrapped around her wrist, white-knuckled, trembling. "She's not worth this," David said desperately. "She's nobody, just a waitress with forged papers and a criminal past." The change in Alessio was instantaneous. One moment he was calm, almost bored. The next, he'd crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and was standing so close to David that the restaurant owner actually whimpered. "Let her go." Each word was precisely enunciated, soft as silk and sharp as a blade. David's hand sprang open like he'd been burned. Alessio stared at him for a long moment, and Julia watched David's face cycle through expressions: fear, desperation, dawning horror. Then Alessio leaned in, close enough that his next words were almost intimate, though Julia heard them perfectly in the deathly quiet kitchen. "She's mine," Alessio said. His voice was gentle, almost kind. "Which means you just put your hands on something that belongs to me. You threatened what's mine. You tried to hurt her." He straightened, smoothed down his shirt, and smiled. That terrible, beautiful smile. "You're dead, David. You just don't know it yet." The kitchen door opened again, and 2 men entered, the same men Julia had seen flanking Alessio in the dining room. Bodyguards, she'd thought. But looking at them now, at the cold professionalism in their movements, the way they positioned themselves on either side of David, she realized they were something else entirely. Soldiers, executioners. "Escort Mr. Romano out," Alessio said without looking at them, his eyes still fixed on the trembling restaurant owner. "Make sure he understands that his employment at La Belle Notte is terminated, effective immediately." "You can't," David started. "I can," Alessio said. "I can do anything I want. This is Florence. This is my city. And you're nothing but a small, stupid man who made the mistake of touching something precious to me." One of the guards, a massive man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, put a hand on David's shoulder. Not rough, but inexorable. David tried to resist, tried to appeal to Alessio, to the kitchen staff who were all studiously staring at their stations. "Please," David said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she was—" "Leave," Alessio said, "while you still can." They dragged David toward the back exit, his protests echoing down the corridor until a door slammed and cut them off entirely. The kitchen remained frozen, no one daring to move or speak. Julia stood there, her wrist throbbing where David had gripped it, her mind unable to process what had just happened. The wealthy customer who'd watched her for 6 weeks wasn't a customer at all. He was a mafia boss, had to be. From the fear in everyone's eyes, the way he'd just dismissed David like swatting a fly. And he'd just claimed her. In front of witnesses, in front of his staff. She's mine. What did that mean? What did he want from her? Alessio turned to face her fully, and the coldness in his eyes melted into something else. Concern, warmth. He moved toward her slowly, like approaching a frightened animal, and Julia's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She just stood there, trembling, as he reached out and gently took her wrist in his hand. His touch was impossibly careful, almost reverent, as he examined the red marks David's fingers had left, bruises already forming on her pale skin. "I'm sorry," Alessio said quietly, his thumb brushing feather-light over the injury. "I should have intervened sooner. I was watching him, watching you, waiting to see if you needed me. And then he touched you. And I—" He stopped, jaw clenching, some emotion Julia couldn't name flickering across his face. "You're safe now," he said, raising his eyes to meet hers. "I promise you, Julia. You're safe. No one will hurt you again." Julia stared at him, this beautiful, terrifying man who'd just upended her entire world, and felt something break open inside her chest. Relief, maybe, or terror, or something far more complicated that she didn't have words for. "Who are you?" she whispered. Alessio smiled, sad and knowing. "I think you already know the answer to that." He did know. She'd known from the moment Paolo had whispered his name, like a prayer to a dark god. Alessio Trevisano, the man who owned Florence, the man who'd just claimed ownership of her. And God help her, the only thing she felt was relief. Julia didn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in her studio apartment in Santo Spirito, staring at the water-stained ceiling, watching dawn creep through the gaps in her curtains and feeling like the walls were closing in. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw at the kitchen, David's face going white with terror, Alessio crossing the room like death itself in a tailored suit. "She's mine." 2 words that had rewritten her entire reality. At 3 a.m., she'd pulled out her phone and typed Alessio Trevisano into Google with shaking fingers. The results had made her stomach turn. Business holdings throughout Tuscany. Charitable donations to hospitals and orphanages. Photos of him at galas in Rome, standing beside politicians and celebrities. Everything carefully curated, perfectly legitimate. But underneath those sanitized results, if you knew where to look, if you clicked past the first few pages, whispers, rumors. A blog post quickly deleted about the Trevisano syndicate's control over Florence's construction industry. A newspaper article from 5 years ago about a rival businessman who'd mysteriously disappeared after a property dispute. Forums where people discussed his family's history in hushed, frightened tones. La Familia, the syndicate, the Cosa Nostra connection that no one dared speak about directly but everyone knew. And she'd spilled wine on him, served him dinner, let him watch her for 6 weeks, while she remained oblivious to the fact that she was being observed by one of the most dangerous men in Italy. What does he want from me? That was the question that had kept her awake, that made her chest tight with anxiety. Men like Alessio Trevisano didn't claim waitresses for no reason, didn't intervene in kitchen confrontations out of the goodness of their hearts. Everything had a price. Everyone wanted something. Nicholas had wanted her respectability, her middle-class background that made his fraud seem legitimate. David had wanted her body, her compliance, her fear. What did Alessio want? By 6 a.m., Julia had made a decision. She wouldn't go back to La Belle Notte. Couldn't go back. She'd pack her go-bag, withdraw what little money she had, and disappear. Again. Maybe Spain this time, or Greece. Somewhere warm where she could lose herself in tourist crowds and seasonal work. She was pulling clothes from her closet when her phone rang. Unknown number, Italian area code. Her hand hovered over the decline button, but something made her answer. "Miss Coleman." A woman's voice, professional and crisp. "This is Francesca from La Belle Notte. I'm calling to inform you that the restaurant will be closed for the next 2 weeks for renovations. You'll continue to receive your full wages, of course. Please stay home and rest. You've been working very hard." Julia's mouth went dry. "Renovations? But we just—" "Management's decision," Francesca said, her tone making it clear she was reading from a script. "You'll be contacted when we reopen. Enjoy your time off, Miss Coleman." The line went dead. Julia stared at her phone, her heart hammering. Renovations. 2 weeks. Convenient timing. Just hours after David Romano had been forcibly removed from the premises by armed men. He's erasing what happened, covering his tracks. Or giving her time. Time for what? The knock on her door made her jump, nearly dropping the phone. She crept to the peephole, half expecting to see Alessio's bodyguards, or worse, police. Instead, a delivery man in a bright uniform stood in the hallway, holding an enormous box. "Delivery for Coleman," he said cheerfully when she opened the door a crack, chain still engaged. "Sign here, please." The box was heavy, expensive looking. Julia carried it inside with trembling hands and opened it on her tiny kitchen counter. Inside, fresh produce, artisan bread, pasta, olive oil, wine, cheese, things she could never afford on her wages. And on top, a cream-colored card in that now familiar elegant script. "You need to eat. You're too thin, eh?" Julia's hand started shaking. He knew where she lived. Of course he did. He'd probably known from the first night she'd served him. Had probably known about her forged references and expired work permit, and the whole sordid story of Nicholas Vane before she'd even realized he was watching her. The violation of it should have terrified her, should have sent her running immediately. But underneath the fear was something else, something warm and unwanted that coiled in her chest. "He's taking care of you." No. That was dangerous thinking. That was how women got trapped. She'd watched it happen to her mother, to friends, to herself with Nicholas. The gifts, the attention, the slow erosion of boundaries, until you didn't remember what freedom felt like anymore. She was pushing the box away when she noticed something else tucked inside. A phone, brand new, expensive, still in its packaging, and another note. "Your phone is old and unsafe. Use this one. It's secure. A." Julia's laugh was slightly hysterical. Secure, as if anything about this situation was secure. She turned on the phone anyway, unable to stop herself, and her stomach dropped when she saw the contact list. One entry. Just one. Alessio. No last name, just his first name, like they were intimates, like he had the right to reduce the distance between them to a single word. Julia set the phone down like it might bite her. This was control. This was a leash disguised as care. The groceries, the phone, the paid time off, all of it designed to make her dependent, to tie her to him, to eliminate her options until she had nowhere else to turn. She should leave. Right now. Before this went any further. She was shoving clothes into her go-bag when the apartment buzzer rang. Julia froze. The buzzer never rang. She had no friends, no visitors, no reason for anyone to know she existed in this building. She crept to the intercom, pressed the button without speaking. "Delivery for Miss Coleman," a different voice said. "Flowers." Flowers. Of course, because groceries and a phone weren't enough. The delivery man handed her a massive arrangement of white roses and peonies, the kind of bouquet that cost more than her monthly rent. The card was tucked among the blooms, and Julia's hands shook as she opened it. "Dinner tomorrow night. My driver will collect you at 7 p.m. This isn't a request. We need to talk about your future." This isn't a request. 4 words that made Julia's chest tighten with something between fury and resignation. Not a request. A command. Because that's what she was now, something he owned. Something he controlled. Something that obeyed when he called. Julia looked around her tiny apartment, the packed go-bag on the bed, the expensive groceries on the counter, the phone with its single contact, the flowers that made the air smell like a funeral. Every exit was blocked. Every option eliminated. Alessio Trevisano had spent 6 weeks watching her, learning her, and now he was systematically removing any possibility of escape. She could run. Right now. Grab the bag and disappear before his driver arrived tomorrow night. But where would she go? She had no money, no papers, no friends, and now, apparently, no job. She was trapped in Florence as thoroughly as she'd been trapped in London, caught between her past and a future that seemed increasingly inevitable. Julia sank onto her bed, the flowers clutched in shaking hands, and for the first time in 8 months, she let herself cry. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from the terrible, treacherous relief of knowing that for the first time since Nicholas, someone was paying attention, someone saw her, someone cared enough to intervene. Even if that someone was the most dangerous man in Florence. Even if his care felt exactly like a cage. The driver arrived at precisely 7 p.m. Julia had spent the day in a fog of indecision, trying on and discarding every piece of clothing she owned, finally settling on a simple black dress that Nicholas had bought her in what felt like another lifetime. She'd kept it because it was expensive enough to sell if she got desperate, but now she wore it like armor, the only nice thing she owned that might be appropriate for dinner with a mafia boss. The car was black, sleek, and worth more than she'd earn in 5 years of serving tables. The driver, not one of the men from the kitchen, but someone older, distinguished, wearing an actual chauffeur's cap, opened the door for her without a word. He didn't ask where they were going. He already knew. They drove through Florence as the sun set, painting the Arno River gold and pink, past the tourists and the gelato shops and the street performers, up into the hills where the city gave way to cypress trees and iron gates, and the kind of wealth that didn't advertise itself with ostentation but with privacy, with walls high enough to hide secrets, with security cameras that tracked their progress up the winding drive. The villa appeared like something from a Renaissance painting: honey-colored stone, terracotta roof tiles, gardens that looked like they'd been maintained for centuries. It probably had been. In Italy, wealth like this was generational, built on foundations of power that went back before laws, before nations, to when might made right and family meant everything. Julia's stomach churned as the car stopped in front of a massive wooden door. This was insane. She was having dinner with a man who'd threatened to kill her former boss. A man who owned half of Florence and probably had blood on his hands. A man who'd decided she belonged to him without bothering to ask her opinion on the matter. The door opened before the driver could reach it. A woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed, smiled warmly at Julia. "Miss Coleman, welcome. I'm Sophia. Mr. Trevisano is waiting for you on the terrace." Sophia led her through rooms that took Julia's breath away, marble floors and frescoed ceilings, artwork that belonged in museums, furniture that was probably older than her entire family line. Everything spoke of wealth so old and established it didn't need to prove anything. It simply was. The terrace overlooked the valley. Florence spread out below them like a jewel box, the Duomo's dome catching the last rays of sunlight. And there, at a table set for two with crystal and silver and candles just being lit, stood Alessio Trevisano. He'd changed from his usual black to something softer, charcoal trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, no tie, the top buttons undone. His hair was damp, like he'd just showered, curling slightly at the ends. He looked younger somehow, less dangerous, until he smiled and Julia saw that predatory awareness in his dark eyes that never quite went away. "Julia," he said, and the way her name sounded in his accent made her shiver. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have much choice," she said, then immediately regretted it. "You didn't antagonize men like Alessio Trevisano. You smiled and agreed and tried to survive." But he just laughed, genuine amusement lighting his face. "No, I suppose you didn't. But I appreciate your honesty. Please, sit. You must be hungry." The meal was exquisite courses Julia couldn't name, wine that probably cost more than her monthly rent, service from Sophia that was unobtrusive and perfect. Alessio asked about her life in Florence, if she'd visited the Boboli Gardens yet, if she preferred the Uffizi or the Accademia. Safe topics, normal conversation. As if they were on an actual date, rather than whatever this was. Julia answered carefully, giving him nothing real, nothing he could use against her. She'd learned that lesson with the police in London. Every word could be twisted, every confession used as ammunition. "You're very guarded," Alessio observed as Sophia cleared their plates. "You keep everything surface level, polite but distant. It's a defense mechanism, yes? Something you learned recently." Julia's hand tightened on her wine glass. "I've learned that trusting people is dangerous." "Trusting the wrong people is dangerous," Alessio corrected. "There's a difference." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with that unnerving intensity. "I know about Nicholas Vane." The world tilted. Julia's breath caught, her chest suddenly too tight. "I don't know what you—" "Yes, you do." His voice was gentle but implacable. "Nicholas Vane, your fiancé. The man who embezzled £4.7 million from his investment clients and disappeared, leaving you to face the investigation. The man who made you look complicit in his crimes even though you had no idea what he was doing." Julia's wineglass slipped from her nerveless fingers. It didn't break. Alessio caught it with reflexes that seemed impossible, setting it safely on the table, but the moment felt suspended, crystallized in amber. "How do you—" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I've had my people investigate," Alessio said simply. "The moment I realized you were running from something, I needed to know what, Who? Whether you were in danger. Whether I needed to eliminate a threat. Eliminate. Julia's laugh was slightly hysterical. You mean kill? If necessary. He said it so casually, like discussing the weather. But in this case, Nicholas Vane eliminated himself. He's dead, Julia. Killed 6 months ago in Prague by his Czech partners when they realized he'd been skimming from their operation too. You're safe from him. Dead. Nicholas was dead. Julia should feel something: relief, vindication, grief for what she'd once thought they had. Instead, she just felt numb. The investigation? She managed. Closed. You were never formally charged. The evidence cleared you, but you ran before you knew that. Alessio's expression softened. You were innocent, Julia. Used. A convenient scapegoat for a man who never deserved you. Something broke open in Julia's chest. She'd spent 20 months believing she was guilty by association, that the police would find her, that she'd spend her life looking over her shoulder. And all this time, she'd been free. She just hadn't known it. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and humiliating, sliding down her cheeks while Alessio watched with something that might have been compassion in his dark eyes. Why? Julia asked through her tears. Why do you care? I'm nobody, just a waitress with a fucked-up past who spilled wine on you. Alessio stood, moving around the table with that fluid grace, and knelt beside her chair. He took her hand, the one with the bruises, from David's grip and held it carefully, like something precious. You're not nobody, he said quietly. You're mine. You have been since the moment you looked at me with those terrified eyes and apologized for ruining my pants. Since you blushed that beautiful pink and stammered through your apology and then served me the rest of the night like nothing had happened. You were so brave, Julia, so determined not to let your fear show. And I knew, in that moment, that I would do anything to protect that courage, to make sure no one ever made you afraid again. That's insane, Julia whispered. You don't even know me. I know you work double shifts even when you're exhausted. I know you give your tips to the dishwasher when his daughter is sick. I know you read Dante on your breaks, and you've been teaching yourself Italian from a library book. I know you're terrified and alone and trying so hard to be invisible. And I know, his thumb brushed over her knuckles, that you deserve better than what life has given you. Better than Nicholas Vane, better than David Romano. Better than running and hiding and being afraid. Better than you? Julia asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Alessio smiled, sad and knowing. No, probably not. I'm a terrible man, Julia. I've done things that would make you run screaming, but I'm your terrible man now. And I protect what's mine. He stood, drawing her up with him, and Julia knew she should pull away, should maintain distance, should remember that this man was dangerous and possessive, and probably a murderer. But his hand was warm and steady, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in years, really seen. Not as a scapegoat or a victim or a frightened woman running from her past, but as herself, as Julia. No one will hurt you again, Alessio said, and it sounded like a vow, like something sacred. You're under my protection now, my care, and anyone who tries to harm you will answer to me. Why? Julia asked again, desperately searching his face for answers. What do you want from me? Everything, he said simply. Your trust, your time, eventually, your heart. But I'm a patient man, tesoro. I can wait. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, to refuse, to run. But Julia didn't move. Couldn't move. She was caught in his orbit like a planet around a dark star, drawn by gravity and heat and something she didn't have words for. When his lips touched hers, it was surprisingly gentle, a question rather than a demand. Julia's eyes fluttered closed, and she kissed him back, tasting wine and danger and something that felt terrifyingly like safety. When she woke, it was in an unfamiliar bed, silk sheets against her skin, early morning light filtering through gauzy curtains. She was still fully dressed in her black dress, shoes removed and placed neatly by the door, alone. On the pillow beside her, a note in that elegant script. My driver will take you home when you're ready. We'll talk soon. Sleep well, tesoro. You're safe here. Always. A. Julia clutched the note in shaking hands and stared at the ceiling of what was clearly a guest room in Alessio Trevisano's villa, trying to understand what had just happened to her life. She'd kissed a Mafia boss, fallen asleep in his home, and woken feeling more protected than she had in years. God help her. She was already lost. La Belle Notte reopened on a Tuesday, and everything had changed. Julia noticed it the moment she walked through the staff entrance, the way conversations stopped when she appeared, the sidelong glances, the careful distance everyone suddenly maintained. Marco, the head chef who'd never spoken more than 2 words to her, actually nodded respectfully as she passed. Francesca, the hostess who'd always been coldly professional, smiled with what looked like nervous warmth. And David Romano was gone. In his place stood a man in his 40s, impeccably dressed, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd managed far more important establishments than this. He introduced himself as Signor Russo, the new general manager, and when he shook Julia's hand, his grip was careful, almost reverent. "Miss Coleman," he said, "it's an honor. Mr. Trevisano has instructed me personally regarding your welfare. You'll be working in the office from now on, reservation management, inventory oversight, whatever you prefer. No more serving tables, no more late nights." Julia stared at him. "I'm a waitress. That's the job I was hired for." "Your position has evolved," Russo said delicately. "Mr. Trevisano feels your talents are better utilized elsewhere." Translation: Alessio didn't want her serving tables anymore. Didn't want her where customers could look at her, speak to her, exist in her orbit. The possessiveness of it made her chest tight. She lasted 4 hours in the office, entering reservations into the computer system, reviewing supplier invoices, suffocating under the weight of everyone's careful politeness, before she couldn't take it anymore. They all knew. Every single staff member knew she was Trevisano's girl, and they treated her accordingly. With respect that felt like fear, with distance that felt like quarantine. At 2 p.m., Julia walked into Russo's office and said, "I quit." The color drained from his face. "Miss Coleman, please. I appreciate the opportunity, but I can't work here anymore." She kept her voice steady, professional. "Consider this my 2 weeks' notice." "You don't understand." Russo looked genuinely distressed. "Mr. Trevisano was very specific. You're to remain employed here, in a safe position, with full benefits, and—" "Mr. Trevisano doesn't get to make decisions about my employment," Julia said. "With all due respect, Miss Coleman, yes, he does. He owns this restaurant, and he's made it very clear that your continued presence here is non-negotiable." The walls were closing in. Julia could feel them, pressing against her lungs, stealing her air. "I'm not a prisoner." Russo's expression was sympathetic but immovable. "Of course not. You're protected. There's a difference." Julia walked out without another word, her hands shaking with fury. She made it to the street before she pulled out the phone. Alessio had given her the one she'd been carrying despite her better judgment, and called the only number in its memory. He answered on the first ring. "Julia, is everything all right?" "You don't own me," she said, her voice tight with anger. "You can't just reorganize my life without asking. You can't tell my employer I'm not allowed to quit. You can't—" "I can," Alessio interrupted gently. "And I did, for your safety." "My safety? Or your control?" A pause. Then, in that soft, dangerous voice, "Don't I? Own you, I mean. Where would you go that I couldn't find you, Tesoro? What would you do without the money I provide, the security I arrange, the protection I offer? You have no papers, no legal right to be in this country. You're running from a past that's already caught up to you. You need me, Julia, whether you want to admit it or not." The truth of it hit like a physical blow. He was right. She was trapped not by bars or chains, but by circumstance and fear, and the systematic elimination of every alternative. He'd made himself indispensable while she wasn't paying attention. "I hate you," Julia whispered. "No, you don't." He sounded almost amused. "But you're afraid of me. That's different. That's smart. Go home, Julia. Rest. We'll talk about this tomorrow when you're calmer." He hung up before she could respond. Julia walked back to Santo Spirito in a daze, her mind churning through options that didn't exist. She could run, but where? He'd find her. He'd already found everything about her past. Finding her future location would be trivial. She could go to the police and tell them what? That a wealthy businessman was being too generous? That he'd given her a job and protection and she was ungrateful? She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice her apartment door was ajar. Julia stopped on the landing, her heart suddenly in her throat. She always locked the door, triple-checked it, obsessive about security. But now it hung open just a crack, darkness visible beyond. She should leave, call someone, call Alessio. Instead, she pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The apartment had been destroyed, furniture overturned, clothes ripped from the closet and scattered across the floor, dishes smashed in the tiny kitchen. Her mattress was slashed open, stuffing spilling out like guts. Every drawer had been pulled out and dumped. And on her bedroom door, carved deep into the wood with something sharp, 4 words, "You belong to me." Julia's knees gave out. She caught herself on the doorframe, bile rising in her throat. David. It had to be David. His handwriting, his psychotic possessiveness, his desperation to punish her for his downfall. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the phone, but she managed to pull it out, managed to press Alessio's number. "Julia?" His voice was sharp, immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "My apartment." Her voice broke. "Someone was here. Someone." "Are you there now?" The sound of movement, urgent commands being issued in Italian in the background. "Are you safe?" "I don't know. I came home and the door was open and everything is destroyed and there's a message. Get out. Now. Go to the street. Stay where people can see you. I'm coming." "Alessio." "Now, Julia." She fled down the stairs, stumbling in her panic, and burst out onto the street just as a black car screeched to a stop in front of her building. Alessio emerged before it fully stopped, his face a mask of cold fury. 2 of his men followed. Both armed, she could see the guns now, not even trying to hide them. Alessio's hands framed her face, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" "No, I just the apartment." "Show me." Julia led them upstairs, staying behind Alessio, as his men cleared the apartment with professional efficiency. When they confirmed it was empty, Alessio stood in the center of the destruction, staring at the carved message on her bedroom door. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "David Romano," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Julia nodded, unable to speak. Alessio turned to one of his men and issued a rapid string of commands in Italian, too fast for Julia to follow, but she caught words like "trovarlo," "find him," and "vivo," "alive." Then he turned back to Julia, and his expression softened fractionally. "Pack a bag," he said. "You're not staying here." "Where am I going?" Julia already knew the answer, had known from the moment she'd called him. There was only one place left for her to go, one person who could keep her safe from David's unraveling desperation. "Home," Alessio said, and pulled her into his arms. "With me. Where you should have been from the beginning." Julia let herself be held, let herself feel protected, and tried not to think about how the cage door was closing, how every crisis pushed her deeper into Alessio's world, how David's violence was accomplishing exactly what Alessio wanted, eliminating her independence, making her need him, binding her to him with chains made of fear and gratitude. She packed her go-bag with shaking hands while Alessio's men photographed the destruction, collected evidence she knew would never reach the police. When she was ready, Alessio took her bag and guided her toward the door. Julia looked back one last time at her tiny apartment, her first real home after London, her sanctuary, her symbol of survival. Now just another thing she was losing. "I'm sorry," Alessio said quietly, and he sounded like he meant it. "I should have moved faster. Should have anticipated this. He won't get another chance, Tesoro. I promise you that." Julia believed him, and that was the most terrifying thing of all, because she knew exactly what Alessio's promises meant, what they cost, and whose blood would pay the price. Julia woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, silk sheets against her skin, and the distant sound of fountains in the garden below. For a moment, a single, disoriented moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back. The villa, Alessio, the cage made of Renaissance marble and armed guards. 1 week. She'd been living in Alessio Trevisano's home for 7 days. The guest room he'd given her was larger than her entire Santo Spirito apartment had been. It had its own bathroom, with a tub the size of a small pool, a walk-in closet that had been filled with clothes in her size. She tried not to think about how he'd known her measurements. And a balcony overlooking Florence that made her chest ache with the beauty of it. A gilded cage was still a cage, no matter how beautiful the bars. Julia pulled on one of the silk robes that had appeared in her closet. Everything in her size, everything expensive, everything chosen by someone who understood what women wore but had never bothered to ask her preference, and padded barefoot through the villa. Even after a week, she still got lost in the maze of rooms. Alessio had shown her the important spaces, the kitchen, the library, the terrace where they'd had dinner, but there were entire wings she hadn't explored, doors that were always closed, rooms she suspected she wasn't meant to see. The staff treated her with that same careful respect that made her skin crawl. Maria, the housekeeper, had breakfast waiting for her every morning, fresh pastries, fruit, coffee that tasted like heaven. Giovanni, the gardener, always smiled and tipped his hat when she walked the grounds. Everyone knew who she was, what she was. Trevisano's woman, the boss's property. The thought made her want to scream. She found Marco in the security office, a room off the main hall filled with monitors showing every angle of the property. Alessio's second-in-command was in his late 30s, built like a boxer, with kind eyes that didn't match the gun holstered at his hip. "Miss Coleman," he said, standing when she appeared in the doorway. "Can I help you with something?" "I was wondering." Julia hesitated. "Can I leave? Go into the city? Just for a walk?" Marco's expression became apologetic. "Mr. Trevisano has asked that you remain on the property for now, for your safety. But if you need anything—" "I need to not be a prisoner," Julia said, more sharply than she intended. "You're not a prisoner." Marco's voice was gentle. "You're protected. There's a difference. Everyone keeps saying that. I'm starting to think you're all trying to convince yourselves." Marco studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "May I speak freely, Miss Coleman?" "Please. Mr. Trevisano is not a good man. I won't lie to you about that. He's done things, we've all done things that keep us awake at night." Marco's gaze was steady, unflinching. "But I've worked for him for 12 years, and I've never seen him like this. Obsessed, protective. He talks about you constantly. Worries about your safety, your happiness, whether you're eating enough. It's unprecedented." "That doesn't make it right," Julia said. "He's taken over my life. I can't work, can't leave, can't make my own decisions. That's not protection. That's ownership. In his world, they're the same thing." Marco's expression was sympathetic but firm. "The rules here are different, Miss Coleman. Love is possession. Protection is control. It's how men like Mr. Trevisano show they care, the only way they know how." "That's toxic." "Yes," Marco agreed simply. "But it's also reality. And the reality is, David Romano is still out there, still angry, still dangerous, until Mr. Trevisano neutralizes that threat. You're safer here than anywhere else in the world." Neutralizes. Such a clinical word for what Julia suspected it actually meant. She was walking back through the villa when she heard Alessio's voice coming from his study. The door was ajar, and she wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his tone stopped her in her tracks. Cold. Final. Absolutely merciless. "I don't care where he's hiding," Alessio said in Italian, his accent sharp with anger. "Find him. I want the David problem resolved by the end of the week. Permanently." Julia's blood ran cold. "Capisco. No, not quick. I want him to know why. I want him to understand that you don't touch what belongs to me and live to regret it." A pause. "I don't care if he's scared. I don't care if he's begging. He carved a message into her door. Luca. He terrorized her. Made her feel unsafe. For that, there's only one appropriate response." Julia's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She should leave, should walk away, should pretend she hadn't heard. But she was rooted to the spot, listening to Alessio plan a murder with the same casual efficiency most people use to plan dinner parties. "Good. And Luca? Make sure there's nothing left to find. I don't want her reading about it in the papers. She doesn't need that on her conscience." The call ended. Silence fell. Then Alessio's voice, soft and knowing. "You can come in, Julia. I know you're there." Julia's heart hammered as she pushed open the door. Alessio sat behind a massive desk, still in his morning clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt, no jacket. He looked tired, she realized. There were shadows under his eyes she hadn't noticed before. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough." Julia's voice shook. "You're going to kill him, David. You're going to have him murdered." "Yes." No hesitation, no attempt to lie or soften it. "Why?" Julia demanded, walking further into the room. "Why does he have to die? Can't you just, I don't know, scare him? Make him leave the country?" Alessio leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Men like David don't scare easily. And they don't stop. He broke into your home, Julia. Destroyed your belongings. Carved a threat into your door. That's escalation. Next time, he won't be satisfied with property damage. Next time, he'll wait for you to come home. You don't know that." "I do." Alessio's voice was gentle but implacable. "I've seen men like him my entire life. Weak men who feel entitled to women's bodies, who can't accept rejection, who escalate until someone stops them permanently. David Romano will not stop until he hurts you. Or until I stop him. Julia wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm morning. I don't want anyone to die because of me. I can't carry that. You won't have to. Alessio stood, moving around the desk with that fluid grace. I'll carry it. I've carried worse, Tesoro. One more death on my conscience is nothing if it means you're safe. That's not justice, Julia said desperately. That's just revenge, murder. Justice. Alessio's laugh was bitter. There is no justice, Julia. Not for men like David, who have money and connections, and the arrogance to think they can take whatever they want. The courts would give him probation. Maybe. A fine. A slap on the wrist. And then he'd be free to find you again. So you get to be judge, jury, and executioner? In my world? Yes. He was close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes. I am the law here. Me. And my law says that anyone who threatens what's mine forfeits their right to live. Julia stared at him, this beautiful, terrifying man who talked about murder like it was a business decision. We see the world so differently. I know. Alessio's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle for someone planning such violence. You still believe in systems, in authorities, in the idea that justice exists somewhere outside of power. I stopped believing that a long time ago. The only law that matters is the one you can enforce yourself. That's a terrible way to live. It's the only way to survive. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. But I don't expect you to understand. Not yet. Maybe not ever. All I ask is that you trust that everything I do to protect you. Even murder. Especially murder. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that Julia felt something break inside her chest. This was who he was. Not the charming dinner companion or the careful lover, but this a man who solved problems with violence and felt no remorse about it. I need time, Julia whispered, to think. Alessio dropped his hand, stepping back to give her space. Of course, I have meetings this afternoon anyway. Marco will be here if you need anything. He walked to the door, then paused, looking back at her. Julia? David Romano broke into your home and threatened you. In a just world, there would be consequences for that. But we don't live in a just world. We live in this one. And in this world, I'm the only consequence that matters. Then he was gone, leaving Julia alone in his study, surrounded by books and art, and the weight of moral choices she'd never wanted to make. She sank into his desk chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her, and stared at the phone he'd been using. One call, one order. And somewhere in Florence, men were hunting David Romano with murder in their hearts. Julia buried her face in her hands and tried to figure out when protection had started to feel like complicity. Julia woke to darkness and an empty bed. She'd been sleeping in Alessio's room for 3 nights now, not because he'd demanded it, but because after another nightmare about David breaking through her door, she'd shown up at his room at 2 a.m., shaking and unable to be alone. He'd simply pulled back the covers and let her in, holding her until she fell asleep, asking for nothing in return. But now his side of the bed was cold, the sheets undisturbed. Julia pulled on one of his shirts. It fell to mid-thigh, smelling like him, cedar and smoke, and went looking. She found him on the terrace, the same one where they'd had dinner that first night. He stood at the railing, looking out over Florence's lights, a cigarette in his hand. She'd never seen him smoke before. Alessio. He turned, and something in his face made her stomach drop. He looked exhausted, haunted, like a man who'd just done something that couldn't be undone. You should be sleeping, he said quietly. So should you. Julia moved closer, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her bare legs. What's wrong? Alessio took a long drag from the cigarette, then stubbed it out in an ashtray on the small table. It's done, he said. David won't hurt you again. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Julia's breath caught. What do you mean, it's done? You know what I mean, Tesoro. His dark eyes held hers, unflinching. The threat has been eliminated. You're safe now. Julia's knees went weak. She gripped the railing for support. You killed him. No. Alessio's voice was calm, matter of fact. I gave the order. There's a difference. Is there? Julia's voice rose despite herself. You ordered someone's death. That makes you responsible. That makes you a murderer? He said it for her, his expression unchanging. Yes, I suppose it does. Add it to the list of my sins. It's a long one. Julia stared at him. This man she'd been living with, sleeping beside, slowly falling for despite every warning her rational mind screamed. David Romano was dead. Because of her. Because Alessio had decided that protecting her required eliminating a threat permanently. She should feel horror, disgust, should be calling the police, running, doing something other than standing here in his shirt while he admitted to orchestrating murder. Instead, what she felt was relief. Sharp, overwhelming, shameful relief that David was gone. That she'd never have to fear him again. Never have to wonder if he was watching, waiting, planning. That the man who'd tried to traffic her, who'd broken into her home, who'd carved threats into her door, would never touch another woman the way he'd tried to touch her. And beneath the relief, something darker. Gratitude. For Alessio. For his willingness to do what she couldn't. To cross lines she'd been raised to respect. To become a monster so she didn't have to. "You're not saying anything," Alessio observed. He'd turned back to the railing, giving her space, giving her time to process. "I don't know what to say." Julia's voice shook. "I should be horrified. I should hate you. I should—" "But you're not. You don't." It wasn't a question. "No." The admission felt like falling. "God help me. I'm relieved. He scared me, Alessio. He made me feel hunted and helpless, and I hated it. Hated him. And now he's gone and I'm glad." Alessio turned to face her fully. "You're glad he's dead. That doesn't make you a bad person, Julia. It makes you human." "Does it?" Tears burned her eyes. "What does it say about me that I'm standing here, knowing you killed someone, and all I can think is thank you? It says you're a survivor." He moved closer, slowly, like approaching something wild. "It says you understand that sometimes the world doesn't offer neat moral solutions. Sometimes there's just survival and the people willing to do terrible things to ensure it. You think this makes you a monster?" Julia asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. "Killing for me?" Alessio's expression was unreadable. "Don't you?" Julia thought about it, really thought about it. About Nicholas, who destroyed her life with lies and manipulation. About David, who tried to sell her like property. About all the men who'd taken from her, used her, hurt her, and faced no real consequences. About systems that protected the powerful and punished the vulnerable. About justice that existed only for people who could afford lawyers and had the right connections. And about Alessio, who'd looked at her and decided she was worth protecting, worth avenging, worth killing for. "I think," Julia said slowly, "that you're the most dangerous man I've ever met. I think you've probably done things that would give me nightmares if I knew the details. I think you're possessive and controlling, and you've completely taken over my life without asking permission." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "And I think I should be more afraid than I am." Something flickered in Alessio's eyes, hope, maybe, or hunger. "But you're not." "No." Julia's hand came up to touch his chest, feeling his heart beat through the thin fabric of his shirt. "I'm not. And I don't know if that makes me broken or lost or just finally safe for the first time in years." Alessio's hand covered hers, holding it against his heart. "Julia." She kissed him before he could finish, rising on her toes to press her mouth to his. It was desperate, claiming, a decision made in the space between heartbeats. She was choosing him, despite everything. Because of everything. Alessio made a sound low in his throat and pulled her close, his kiss consuming, possessive, like he was trying to brand her as his from the inside out. Julia let him, opening to the intensity of it, the dark promise of what they were becoming together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alessio rested his forehead against hers. "If you stay," he said quietly, "there's no going back. You'll be mine, completely. You'll be part of this world, this life. People will know you belong to me. There will be danger, Julia, and blood, and choices you'll have to make that will change who you are." "I know," Julia whispered. "And you're staying anyway?" Instead of answering with words, Julia kissed him again, softer this time, a benediction and a surrender all at once. They stood there on the terrace as dawn broke over Florence, wrapped in each other, while somewhere in the city, David Romano's body floated in the Arno River, and Julia Coleman became someone new. The news broke over breakfast. Julia was sitting at the terrace table, coffee in hand, trying not to think too hard about the previous night, when Alessio's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then turned on the television, mounted discreetly in the corner of the outdoor space. The morning news anchor's face was grave as she reported, "The body of David Romano, 52, was discovered early this morning in the Arno River near Ponte Vecchio. Romano, the former manager of the upscale restaurant La Belle Notte, appears to have died by suicide, according to preliminary police reports. He left a note confessing to fraud and expressing remorse for his actions. The investigation is ongoing, but authorities say there are no signs of foul play. Giulia's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Suicide. A confession note. No signs of foul play. It was a lie. All of it. Carefully orchestrated, meticulously executed, leaving no trail back to Alessio Trevisano, or the men who'd actually ended David Romano's life. Alessio's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm. "It's over," he said quietly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Giulia stared at the screen, at the photo of David they'd pulled from somewhere, him smiling at a charity event, looking respectable and harmless. No one watching would know what he'd really been, what he'd tried to do, the women he'd victimized, the threats he'd made. History would remember him as a man who'd succumbed to his demons, not as a predator who'd been put down by something more dangerous than himself. "Giulia?" Alessio's voice was gentle. "Talk to me. What are you thinking?" Giulia set down her coffee cup with hands that were surprisingly steady. She could leave now. This was her chance. Alessio had eliminated the threat. She was free from David, from the fear, from the immediate danger that had kept her here. She could walk away, go back to London, now that the investigation was closed, start over somewhere new, reclaim the independence she'd lost. She turned to look at Alessio, this beautiful, terrible man who'd killed for her, who'd remake the world to keep her safe, who loved her in a way that was both salvation and damnation. "If I stay," Giulia said quietly, "if I'm truly yours, what does that make me?" Alessio's expression was serious, no trace of the charming smile he used with others. "Mine," he said simply. "It makes you mine. And that means I protect you, provide for you, kill for you if necessary. It means you're part of my world now, with all the darkness that entails. It means you'll be complicit in things you once would have condemned. It means choosing me over everything else, your morals, your safety, maybe even your soul. That's a lot to ask." "I know." His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I'm a selfish man, Giulia. I want you anyway, but I won't lie about what staying means. I won't pretend this is anything other than what it is, a descent into darkness with me." Giulia thought about London, about Nicholas and the life she'd lost, about running and hiding and being afraid, about the woman she'd been trusting, naive, believing in systems and justice, and the inherent goodness of people. That woman was gone, had died somewhere between the police interrogation in the ransacked apartment and the moment she'd kissed a Mafia boss on his terrace while a man drowned in the river below. In her place was someone harder, someone who understood that safety wasn't a right but a privilege, bought with power and maintained with violence, someone who could look at a murder and feel grateful. Giulia didn't say yes out loud, didn't need to. Instead, she leaned into Alessio's touch, let him pull her close, and watched the morning sun turn the Arno River gold. The same river that had swallowed David Romano's body in the night and would carry it out to sea, taking her old life with it. She was Alessio Trevisano's now, for better or worse, in darkness and in blood. And God help her, she was choosing it anyway. 6 months later, Alessio Trevisano watched his wife move through their villa with the confidence of someone who'd finally found where she belonged. Giulia had her hair pulled back today, the caramel highlights catching the afternoon sun as she spoke rapid Italian to the caterer negotiating, not asking. Her fluency now flawless after months of immersion and private tutors. She wore ivory, simple and elegant, the kind of understated luxury that only the truly wealthy could afford. A strand of pearls at her throat, his grandmother's, given to him the night before with instructions to choose wisely. He had chosen. God help them both. He'd chosen the moment she'd spilled wine on his lap and looked at him with those terrified, beautiful eyes. "Signor Trevisano," Marco appeared at his elbow, immaculate in his dark suit. "The cars are ready. The chapel is prepared. Everything is as you requested." "Giulia?" Alessio asked, not taking his eyes off her. Nervous but ready. Marco's expression softened, even his hardened second-in-command had fallen under Giulia's spell these past months. "She's remarkable, Capo. You chose well." Alessio smiled, that private smile he reserved for thoughts of her. "I didn't choose. I claimed. There's a difference. And yet she stayed. And yet she stayed." Alessio agreed, wonder still threading through the words. After everything, the violence, the control, The darkness he'd dragged her into, she'd stayed. More than stayed. She'd bloomed in his world like a night flower, finding strength in the shadows he'd thought would break her. The wedding was small, private, exactly as Julia had requested. A hillside chapel overlooking Florence, centuries old, with frescoes on the ceiling and candles that flickered in the breeze from the open doors. Only 30 guests, Alessio's most trusted people, the family that mattered. No press, no spectacle, no announcement to the world that Alessio Trevisano had taken a wife. Those who needed to know would know. The rest would find out when he wanted them to. Julia walked down the aisle alone, no father to give her away, no family to witness. Just her, in a simple silk gown that made Alessio's breath catch, carrying white roses and looking at him like he was both her salvation and her doom, which, he supposed, he was. The priest spoke in Italian, and Julia answered in the same language, her accent nearly perfect now. When Alessio slid the ring onto her finger, platinum with a single diamond, nothing ostentatious, because Julia didn't need ostentation to be breathtaking, his hand shook slightly. This woman, this impossible, resilient, complicated woman who'd looked at the darkness in his soul and chosen it anyway. Ti amo, he whispered as he kissed her, the words he'd never said to another living soul. I love you. Julia's eyes glistened with tears. Anch'io, she whispered back. Me too. The reception at the villa was elegant chaos, music and wine and laughter. Florence's elite paying their respects to the new Signora Trevisano. Politicians and businessmen, artists and old money families, even a cardinal who'd known Alessio's grandfather. They came with gifts and smiles and carefully neutral expressions that hid their calculations. Julia moved through them with grace that still surprised Alessio. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened waitress who flinched at loud voices. Now she held court like she'd been born to it, conversing in Italian and English, charming even the most austere guests with her intelligence and wit. Your wife is extraordinary, Senator Ricci said, appearing at Alessio's side with a glass of champagne. Where did you find her? She found me, Alessio said, watching Julia laugh at something the French ambassador's wife had said. Or perhaps we found each other. Lucky man. The luckiest. But luck had nothing to do with it. Luck was chance, random, uncontrollable. What Alessio had done was deliberate. He'd seen what he wanted and taken it, reshaped Julia's entire existence until staying with him was the only logical choice. Until she couldn't imagine life without him, any more than he could imagine life without her. Some would call it manipulation. Alessio called it love. Julia caught his eye across the terrace and smiled that private smile that was only for him, full of knowledge and acceptance, and something that might have been contentment. She excused herself from her conversation and came to him, slipping her hand into his like it belonged there. Which it did. Everything about her belonged to him now. Tired? He asked quietly. A little. She leaned into him, unconcerned with the watching eyes. Happy, though. No regrets? Are you asking if I regret marrying you? Julia looked up at him, her expression serious. Or if I regret everything that led to this moment? Either. Both? Julia was quiet for a moment, considering. Around them, the party continued, music and laughter and the clink of crystal. But in their small bubble of space, there was only truth. I regret that David had to die, she said finally, her voice low enough that only Alessio could hear. I regret that I'm glad he's dead. I regret that I understand your world now in a way that probably makes me complicit in things I don't even know about. But marry you? She squeezed his hand. No, I don't regret that. Even knowing what it means, what you've become. Especially knowing that. Julia's smile was sad and knowing. I'm not the woman I was in London. I'm not even the woman who spilled wine on you 6 months ago. But I think maybe I'm finally who I was always meant to be. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. Alessio had watched her transformation with something like awe, the way she'd stopped flinching, started speaking up, learned to exist in his world without apology. She'd shed her fear like a snake shedding skin, revealing something harder and more resilient beneath. She was his now, completely. And the tragedy and triumph was that she'd chosen it. Dance with me, Alessio said, pulling her toward the space where other couples were swaying to the music. Julia went willingly, fitting against him like she'd been made for this. They moved together in silence for a long moment before she spoke again. Do you have any regrets? She asked. About us? About how this started? Alessio thought about the kitchen at La Belle. Notte. David's hand on Julia's wrist, the cold fury that had consumed him. About the decisions he'd made since investigating her past, orchestrating David's death, systematically eliminating every option she'd had except him. "My only regret," he said honestly, "is that I didn't act sooner, that I watched you for 6 weeks while that bastard looked at you like property, that I let you be afraid for even a moment longer than necessary. So you don't regret manipulating my life, taking away my choices?" "I gave you choices," Alessio corrected gently. "Just not the ones you thought you wanted. I gave you safety instead of freedom, protection instead of independence, love instead of autonomy, and you chose to stay. Because you made it impossible to leave. Because you didn't want to leave." He pulled back to look at her. "Be honest, Tessero. If I'd given you money and papers and let you disappear, would you have been happy? Would you have felt safe? Or would you have spent the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next threat, the next man who wanted to use you?" Giulia's eyes filled with tears. "I hate that you're right." "I know," he kissed her forehead, "but I am." They left for Sicily the next morning, just the two of them and a driver. A villa on the coast, far from Florence and its politics and its watchful eyes. A honeymoon in the place where Alessio's family had originated, where the old ways still held sway and power was respected above all else. The villa was smaller than the one in Florence, perched on cliffs overlooking the Mediterranean. The water was impossibly blue, the air scented with salt and lemons and wild herbs. Giulia stood on the terrace, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, and Alessio watched her. "Do you think I'm different now?" she asked without turning around. Alessio moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "You're exactly who you were always meant to be." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." He rested his chin on top of her head. "You were always this strong, Giulia, this resilient, this capable of surviving in dark places. You just didn't know it yet. I didn't change you. I just gave you permission to become yourself." Giulia was quiet, processing. "Then, I think about London sometimes, about Nicholas and the investigation and how scared I was, about the woman who ran away with a suitcase and no plan. She feels like a stranger now. Because she is. That woman doesn't exist anymore." "No." Giulia turned in his arms to face him. "She doesn't. And I don't know if that's tragic or triumphant or both." "Both," Alessio said. "Always both. That's what survival looks like." Giulia studied his face, memorizing it in the golden light. This man who'd killed for her, who'd given her safety at the cost of her innocence. Who loved her with a possessiveness that would have terrified her 6 months ago but now felt like the only honest thing in her life. "I've traded one cage for another," she said quietly. "Nicholas's cage was made of lies, yours is made of gold and armed guards, and blood I'll never see but always know is there. But at least with you, I know the bars exist. At least I chose to walk in. And would you walk out? If I opened the door?" Giulia thought about it, really thought about it. About freedom and independence and all the things she'd once believed she needed. About the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. About loneliness and safety and the terrible comfort of being completely known by someone who would burn the world to protect you. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I would, because this cage has you in it. And maybe that's enough." Alessio kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promises he'd kill to keep. When they finally broke apart, the sun had nearly set, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. They stood together on the terrace, Giulia leaning back against Alessio's chest, his arms wrapped around her like a fortress. The Mediterranean breeze was warm and salt-sweet, carrying away the tension of the day, the weight of their choices, the complexity of what they'd become together. Giulia closed her eyes and let herself feel at this moment of peace after so much chaos. She thought about Florence, about La Belle Notte, about Table 14 where this had all begun. Right now, the dinner service would be starting. A new couple would be sitting at that corner booth, sharing wine and intimate conversation, completely unaware of the story that table held. They wouldn't know that the woman who'd once served them now owned the restaurant through marriage, that the frightened waitress had become something else entirely. Giulia Coleman was gone. In her place stood Giulia Trevisano, wife of a Mafia boss, complicit in his darkness, protected by his violence, loved with an intensity that was both salvation and damnation. She'd lost her innocence somewhere between London and Florence, between Nicholas's betrayal and David's threats and Alessio's possessive love. She'd lost the woman who believed in justice and law and the inherent goodness of systems designed to protect. But she'd gained something too, something precious and terrible and irrevocable. She'd found belonging. Not freedom. Freedom was an illusion. She understood that now. Everyone was trapped by something. Circumstance, fear, love, survival. But belonging was real. Being known completely and claimed absolutely, and protected ferociously. In Alessio's arms, she'd found not liberation but something more dangerous. Home. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and Giulia Trevisano opened her eyes to the darkness that had always been waiting for her. Finally unafraid. Ti amo, she whispered to the man who'd killed for her, who'd caged her, who'd given her the only kind of safety she could trust. Per sempre, Alessio whispered back against her hair. Forever. And in that moment, with the Mediterranean at their feet and the night falling around them, Giulia believed him. Because men like Alessio Trevisano didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They just made sure the world bent to accommodate them.